Alright everybody, we're going to continue on our demonstration of Andean Abyss. So this is video number 2 here. And we've already explained all the game pieces, so let's go ahead and jump in and see how this game works. Now, this is a card-driven game, but not in the classical sense of card-driven games like Paths of Glory, etc. How it's going to work, the biggest difference is, first of all, no player has a hand of cards. Instead, what happens is you play cards off the deck in a what you see is what you get fashion with one small twist. I just pulled the top card off the deck, which is the event Mancuso, and I reveal the next card on top of the deck, which happens to be Op Millennium. Now, in a physical game, what you do is you flip the first card face up, and then you take the card that's on top of the deck and flip it over as well. The idea being that the players can always see one card into the future. Now, for new players, this may slow the game down considerably as they're learning the game's mechanics, and it may induce analysis paralysis. So what we recommend is for the first time players play, that they actually just play off the top of the deck, what you see is what you get, till they get a good grasp of how the game works. The game's mechanics are really quite simple, but the interaction between the factions and the decisions that the players have to make are where the complexity comes in. The game rules are only about 12 pages long, so the 4-player rules are really quite simple in terms of their mechanics. But because each faction can work somewhat differently, that's where the complexity comes in. In some ways, this game is like Here I Stand, because each faction has its own path to victory, which is not necessarily diametrically opposed to another faction. So you're going to have shifting alliances between the different factions, and the diplomacy in the game is very open-ended. You can make deals, transfer resources one to another as the players desire, and nothing's binding. So make deals at your own peril, as it were, in the game. On the cards itself, you'll notice that there's a sequence of symbols across the top. Let me show you the sequence of play display up here. What's going to happen is there's 4 different factions in the game, but only 2 factions will be able to take any kind of activity on a given card. So on the very first card of the game, Mancuso, what we're going to do is we're going to establish who is the first eligible faction to play that particular card. To do so, we look at the leftmost symbol up at the top. So priority stretches from left to right. So first priority is the yellow star, yellow and blue star. That's the AUC. Then the government. Then you have the drug cartels. Then you have the FARC. So that's the order of eligibility. Whoever has their eligibility markers here in the eligibility box is eligible to play on that card. So looking at this, AUC has the first opportunity to do something on this particular card. Now, to do something on the card, what you'll want to do is the first eligible faction can do one of 4 things. They can execute an operation only, that is, or they can execute an operation plus a special activity. Special activities give you an extra oomph to your operation. And the third option is they can execute the event. Now, if the event has 2 segments, a shaded and an unshaded portion, the executing faction may decide to execute either the shaded or the unshaded, but never both. As a general principle, the shaded portions tend to hurt the government, whereas the unshaded portions tend to not hurt the government. Not necessarily help, but not necessarily hurt. The fourth option is a player can also pass. If they are an insurgent faction, and the AUC, FARC, and cartels are all considered to be insurgents, if you're an insurgent faction, you may pass and gain 1 resource. The government, if they pass, they get 3 resources, which are tabulated here along this numbered track. All the insurgents start the game with 10 resources, and the government starts with 40. They may sound like it's out of balance, but government activities, government operations cost 3 times as much as the cost of the insurgent operations. Furthermore, the government operations tend to be quite a bit more powerful, but they cost 3 times as much. So those are some of the things that players will need to consider. All right, so Mancuso, AUC is first up, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see the card a little bit better. It says here the unshaded portion says AUC number 2 imprisoned, AUC resources -3, remove 1 AUC base. Well, definitely don't want to do that. Another option is AUC resources +3 for each space with AUC and cartel pieces. Well, looking at the map, that might not be a bad play. The AUC is actually in Putumayo with cartel pieces, and they're also in Guaviare with cartel pieces. And that's about it, but that would be each space with an AUC and cartels piece. That would be 6 resources, and resources are kind of hard to come by for the AUC. So I'm actually going to go ahead and execute that event with the AUC. The other option, they could do some operations, but I'm looking at the next card. Passing is out of the question here because they're last priority on the next card, so they might as well do something here. Now, when you take an operation, you will be ineligible on the next card. That's another consideration that will come into play, and that's another reason why I decided to do something with the AUC right here rather than pass and collect a resource. So here they're going to go ahead and take the event, collect 3 resources for one space, 3 more for the other, and so they're sitting in a very good financial position. The next eligible faction happens to be Mancuso. Happens to be the government on Mancuso. Looking at the next card here, Operation Millennium, the government's second up on that particular card, but the cartels, it's likely will go ahead and take that particular event. So I'm going to go ahead and activate the government to take its second eligible faction activity. Now, here's the deal. As I said, the first eligible faction chooses to execute an op only, an op with special activity, an event, or they may pass. But whatever the first eligible faction does determines what the second eligible faction may do. Because AUC took the event, government has these options available to them. You just follow the arrow. They may execute an operation. They may also execute a special activity. That's their only option here on this particular card. Now, if the AUC took this option here, if they did an op with a special activity, then the government would be limited to executing either the event or a limited operation. A limited operation is an operation which only impacts a single space. If, say, the AUC wanted to take operations, but there's a dangerous event and they didn't want anyone to play it against them, they could take an op only, and that limits the second eligible faction to either execute a limited op or they can pass. That's it. That's all they could do. So sometimes if you want to bury an event, you're just going to do an op only without the special activity. Well, the government's going to go ahead and do some stuff here, and to mark where we're going to do things, we're going to actually use these white action pawns. And the very first thing that the government needs to do is get more pieces on the board. So we're actually going to train some units, and we're going to train here. And we're also going to train, I want to say, we need to have some presence here up in the north, I think. So I'm going to say we're going to train up here in Santa Marta. So we're going to train in 2 locations. And training, here's how that works. By the way, there is a player aid card. It's 11 by 17 inches, and it's got 4 panels on it, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. So each player is going to have one of these in the game, and they'll be able to see what every single other faction will do. So it's got the government has its menu of operations and special activities and stuff it can do, and then it's got everything that the cartels, the AUC, and the FARC can do. So that was one thing we learned from Labyrinth, is that with the player aid cards now in this game, you can see what everybody can do at a glance. So government's going to train, and what that does is it allows the government to add cubes or cylinders, or discs to a particular location. Now, the government may only train in a department or in a city. Now, if they train in a department, the department must have a base. That's where the government needs its bases, is out in departments. Incidentally, I should mention this, that departments may only contain 2 bases. Cities may only contain 2 bases. Once there's 2 bases, doesn't matter whose bases they are, no more bases can be placed there. So for example, Meta West, Guaviare, Meta East, these are fully stacked departments. Well, the government's going to go ahead and train troops here in Cali. And what they can do is they have to spend 3 resources every space that they're training. Now, I could train in as many spaces as I could train in all these cities if I wanted to, but it's 3 resources per space. So I'm going to pay 6 resources down to 34. And in each selected space where I'm training, I can place up to 6 cubes, and they can be of any given type. So in Cali, I need some troops. So I'm going to put 4 troops, and I'm going to put 2 police. And I could do 4 police and 2 troops if I want. I can mix and match it however I choose. And I'm going to go ahead and put those into Cali. Next, up here in Santa Marta, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to do 4 police and 2 troops. Put those in here. So I've got lots of police up here being trained. And then I'll get rid of the action pawn here. Now, down in Cali, once you've done this, at each selected city or government-based department, you place up to 6 cubes. Then, in up to 1 selected space, wherever you want, in 1 selected space, replace 3 cubes with 1 government base. So I could establish a base here in Cali, but again, it doesn't make any sense to do so. So I'm not going to do that, or I could do it up here in Santa Marta if I wanted to. But again, establishing a base in a city doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm not going to do that. Or my second option here is in one of these spaces where I trained, if I have at least 3 or more troops or 3 or more police, and I have more pieces total in that space than any of the other factions put together, then I may do what's called a civic action. So in other words, if I have more pieces here than anyone else, then I'm considered to control that space. For the government, what a civic action is I may increase the support away from opposition in that space. So here I'm going to go ahead and take and remove the neutrality and make it passive support. That cost me 3 resources. And then to flip the passive support marker over to active support cost me 3 more. Let's say, for example, that the place had active opposition. If it was at active opposition, I could spend 3 to go to passive, 3 more to remove that marker, and in the physical game, no marker means it's neutral. The neutral marker here is just a vassal convenience. And I could spend 3 more to go passive, 3 more to go active support. So you can see how you can make huge shifts, but it's very expensive. In this case, I only shifted it 2 levels, so I spent 6 more resources. So 3, 4, 5, 6. So you see, I've done quite a bit here as the government, but I burned through 12 resources doing it. So I'm done here. Now the support has increased for me. So I look at the population down here and I multiply it by the support multiplier. Passive support would be ×1. Active support is ×2. So I take the population times 2, that's 6, and I add that to my support track here. And now I'm only, looks like 5 away from victory here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 would get me to 61, and I'd be in a winning position on a propaganda phase. So that concludes the early part of my operation. Now I may do a special activity. A special activity is one of the following: airlift, airstrike, or eradicate. And I'll show you how those things work in our next video.